There is a particularly beautiful bit of Patagonia in Argentina, next to these two gigantic lakes and surrounded by geological formations. And it's there that there is one of the world's largest shale oil deposits. Now, back in 2010, when this was first being explored and discovered, the Argentine government thought that they were sitting on an absolute gold mine. And of course, the world's major oil companies descended en masse. One project in particular became a major issue, a joint venture between Chevron and the Argentine national oil company YPF. Indigenous Mapuche people have accused the company of dumping waste materials into the surrounding area, contaminating water sources, causing tons of health problems for locals, and all of this is happening on land that oil companies and the Argentine government have a dubious claim to in the first place. Ultimately, this is probably indigenous land. But it doesn't seem to matter. Why? Because there's money to be made. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Hello, and welcome back to our series on Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. And this week we are stepping into the third chapter. That is, of course, the invisible sources of power. And that means we are talking about all the resources that you cannot see. Everything buried underground, all the metals, all the minerals, all the hydrocarbons, all of that good stuff. If you haven't already, I recommend you at least go back and watch the introduction lecture to this book, because I give you a bunch of background on who Galeano was, a lot of the historical context, a lot of what came after. This book was written in 1971. It's just sort of helpful stuff to have in mind as you go in and start to read through this book. I also recommend you check out chapter 2, which is all about agricultural products. So if we're talking about minerals and metals and hydrocarbons this week, last week we were talking all about sugar and cacao and coffee and all of the stuff that you can grow on top of the ground. Sort of the agricultural part of what is this story of extraction. And you'll find that a lot of the mechanisms that we talked about then, especially when we get into things like the natural resource curse, they still apply when you get into things like metals. And especially when you start talking about things like oil, which Galeano spends a lot of time in this chapter talking about oil. And of course, so will we. Now, you can check out all of this and more on the Champagne Anarchism Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. All of this reading series, the main feed stuff, is absolutely free up on that site. And so you can go and check that out and read through this stuff in your own time. And while we're on it, please don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube, on all of my social channels, especially TikTok. And thank you to everybody who follows me already. It is just really cool to be able to do this. But let's get into it already, because just like last time when we talked about agricultural products, I'm going to try to cluster this chapter into a few themes, because as you will find, if you've already started reading this book, if you're already reading through it, maybe along with this series, which would be awesome, but if you're already reading Galeano, you know that Galeano can be very sprawling. This guy is an amazing writer, but he can be a little chaotic when he's pulling together examples. Maybe that's just how genius minds work, I don't know, but let's focus our thoughts up a little bit here when we get to chapter 3. And we're going to be covering this in 5 rough sections, and necessarily there's a lot of crossover between these sections, and we won't be going directly through all the history. I'm not going to be telling you everything from this chapter that is laid out here by Galeano, because ultimately this is a work of history, and I think, while we can give a little bit of the structure, it's worthwhile going back in and actually sitting with this text and reading through the prose and understanding all of the historical examples that he's employing here. So we won't blow by blow go through all the history, but we are going to reference all of the things that he's talking about, at least in these 5 themes. What are those 5 themes? Let's go through them. Number 1, we're going to talk about the corporation, the rise of the foreign corporation as an exploiter in the Latin American context. Number 2, we'll be talking about the argument that exploitation of these resources constitutes a matter of national security. This is something that Galeano sets out very early in this chapter as he's talking about this. And as I will say, this argument of national security is still very much with us today. And in fact, later on, we'll look at maybe a modern incarnation of the national security argument that I think is even more pernicious, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Third, number 3, we're going to talk about the state and the ways that the state acts in evil ways to back up corporate power and to enhance this idea of national security. These are kind of two sides of the same coin here. Then, number 4, we're going to take some time considering the local side of things, and we're going to talk about how kleptocrats are formed, sort of the local elites. There's often this question, right? Is there something inherently corrupt about Latin America and its politicians? I'm going to say no. And finally, when we conclude this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about stuff that is not in this chapter, a little bit of an update for the present day, just a little bit, just to give some ideas about where we could take this kind of analysis right now. And we're going to speculate a little bit on this. Because the thing is, none of this has changed at all. It's just changed its form. We've been exploiting minerals, we've been blowing up mountains since the early days of colonization. And the only thing that's really changed over that time period is the sort of thing that is being mined. And Galeano talks about this in this chapter. He talks about the switch from nitrates in Chile to copper in Chile. There is always this type of exploitation. What form does it take is an open question, but what's not really in question is that it is being exploited. And so, for example, I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about green technology and the possible avenues of exploitation on the horizon for humanity. But let's jump right in here and let's talk about the corporation. Now, as you may have noticed, as I've kind of hinted at, this is the sister chapter for chapter 2. So just like we talked all about agriculture, we will now talk all about minerals. And just like in that chapter, you've got major foreign corporations coming to the front and operating like mini empires or almost mini fiefdoms within the developing world. Just this time, they're extracting minerals from the earth instead of planting and using the latifundio system that we talked about before. And Galeano name drops a few of the major companies, and it's worth going through them really quickly just so that we know their names and we know what they're doing now. So he talks, for example, about Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which was also known as Amalgamated Copper variously. It was later purchased by a company called Arco and even later by BP, that's British Petroleum, and that's where its sort of modern form is. He also talks about Kennecott, which is the Kennecott Copper Corporation, which was weirdly also later acquired by BP and is now actually part of the massive mining conglomerate Rio Tinto. He also talks about U.S. Steel, which still exists, and Bethlehem Steel, which filed for bankruptcy in 2001. Its assets were kind of stripped out in those bankruptcy proceedings and sold to International Steel Group, which is now part of Middle. You've also got Hanna Mining, which is now split among a few different entities. And then, of course, you have all of the oil companies he talks about. And oil is its own thing, but from the mining operations, you may get the impression from all of this that there are a lot of major players that just sort of disappeared over the ages, right? We're talking about all these being sort of sold off and stripped for assets and bankruptcy and stuff like that. That's not really true. Really what happened is they just kind of changed their form. Now, there do exist major local mining companies and oil companies, of course. You have everything from Chile's Codelco to Mexico's Pemex, Brazil's Vale, or Vala, I suppose it would be. I guess I've just always said Vale. Petrobras, everything in between. A lot of this is happening now at a local level, but typically they take on foreign partners, and the foreign companies are still very, very much present in the region. They've just taken on, in some cases, different names, and in some cases, they're new faces. So some of the biggest, most massive operators existing across the region and still extracting just as they always did are things like Southern Copper or Freeport or Rio Tinto, BHP, Glencore, and then there are some, I guess, reasonably new entrants from China. There's China Shenhua and China Minmetals, which are both very much part of the same extractive model, just with Chinese characteristics. Now, the thing to understand about all of these companies, all of these corporations when we're talking about them, is that they're evil, they're capitalistic, they're extractive, all of that, but more than that, they operate as kind of the perfect fusion of state and private corporate power. So we can't really talk about the corporation as such, just as an independent power. That's actually never really happened. None of this is possible without three things. First of all, you have the direct interventions from the government back home. And most often in this chapter, we're talking about the United States, although sometimes we're talking about Britain, sometimes we're talking about the Dutch. But Galeano is mostly writing in a context, especially in the 70s, of the United States dominating Latin American affairs. So that's the first thing. thing. The second thing is none of this would also be possible if the country being exploited didn't need to be locked into the international commodity markets, which is something that we talked about last time. So just like the Cuban revolutionaries, after they had fought this revolution, realized that they couldn't escape the clutches of the sugar market, they couldn't just burn the sugarcane fields because Cuba was locked in a dependent relationship with the rest of the world. They needed that sugar. It was their only available cash crop. Although we'll talk about the U.S.'s support for the Batista regime, which Galeano mentions in this. There's a lot of zinc and manganese in Cuba, so we'll talk about that in a second. But just in terms of sugar, Cuba found that it couldn't avoid being a sugar producer. So there is very much a domestic side of this. Chile needs the copper to be there. That's just part of the equation. And the third thing here is that none of this would be possible without the consent of local power brokers, normally elites in the exploited countries that are looking to make some money. Galeano, for example, gives us the really incredible example of Simón Iturri Patiño, the Bolivian tin tycoon who built an empire and promptly moved to London. So this is a Bolivian man, actually quite an impoverished Bolivian man when he starts out, and then he makes an empire. He builds it, and it becomes global. He starts acquiring assets across the world, and of course, he doesn't stay in Bolivia. He goes and moves to London, and he spends the rest of his life kind of, between London and Paris, trying to live the life of a European aristocrat. And even, this is an extreme example. There are plenty of elites who don't literally move back to Europe, but stay and operate as kings in their local kingdom. And that's kind of just the nature of the game. You need some kind of local buy-in at the level of the local aristocracy. You need the local bourgeois to become part of the system as well. And Galeano is very targeted in this respect. Also, if you've been following along for a while on this channel, you will remember when we were talking about Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, this is something that he's extremely concerned about, let me say. He is fighting this revolution, but at the same time, he believes the revolution can fall at the hands of the foreign power or at the hands of the domestic power. He's very, very worried about these local elites. And Galeano very much follows this model. Now, the other thing here is that when we talk about foreign corporations operating in a colonized context, one of the things that often is mentioned is just the conditions and the wages that allow the colonizer nation to continue life as it is. Like their wonderful lives that they're living, their high wages that they're enjoying are all coming at the cost of exploitation around the rest of the world. Galeano here says that the starvation wages that are being paid by foreign companies just support the colonizer nation. And he has some really harrowing descriptions of the tin empire of Patiño that's being developed and the workers that are living through this hell in order to send money to people like Patiño and, of course, the foreign companies that are there exploiting and benefiting from the tin. He has this line about Kennecott, for example. He says, the average wage in Chilean mines in 1964 was barely 1/8 of the basic Kennecott refinery wage in the United States, although the workers' productivity was the same. And this just leaves us with a deeply messed up situation. Take the example of nitrates, which we mentioned very briefly here. So nitrates used to be an absolute gold mine in Chile, and Chile was locked very much into their production. This is something that Chile needed to continue to export, and they found themselves further and further in debt to the British Empire and British financiers. And then, of course, there were locals who flocked to exploit nitrates and get what capital they could out of them. And then, of course, back in Europe, there was John Thomas North and the Liverpool Nitrate Company, which was paying 40% dividends at one point, which is an insane rate. And then, of course, remember natural resource curse from the last chapter that we talked about, the nitrate market collapses. And when the nitrate market collapses, which Galeano describes, Chile was left with the bill and the workers are the ones getting screwed. So the exploitation of nitrate had already happened. All of this capital had already flowed out of the region, out of these open veins of nitrate in Chile. And all that was left was devastation and a gaping hole that was eventually just filled with another alternative, and that alternative, of course, was copper. But let's leave the corporation for just a moment and let's turn to the other side of this. What does this look like in the colonizer country? Let's talk about national security. Now, Galeano spends a lot of time thinking about this idea Right at the beginning of this chapter, he says, quote, "Bullets are needed to kill Vietnamese, and bullets need copper. Later, planes cannot be built without aluminum, and aluminum cannot be produced without bauxite." And this is a crucial insight here because the United States and other developing countries have grown to a point of dependency as well. So remember dependency theory. We talked about this in the introduction lecture. Dependency theory is the idea that the periphery nations of the world rely on capital from the metropole. So while natural resources and excesses that are gained from cheap labor in the developing world flow towards the center, it is also true kind of the reverse of that the metropole actually needs this stuff. It needs the raw materials. It needs that labor to sustain its existence. Galeano says that to maintain its living standards, its living conditions, both in peace and in war, we'll talk about that in a sec, but both in peace and in war, the United States needs Latin America. And that's still true, but that part, the war part, it's also worth a particular look. So the United States has been in a state of perpetual war basically since its inception. There are periods of peace, but the vast majority of this historical trend is war. When you read Emma Goldman, you will understand why. The economy, capitalism, patriotism, all of this relies on war. But to keep the war going, you need inputs, and you need them cheaply. And so in a very real way, the United States is actually right to consider these minerals a vital matter of national security because they must wage these wars to continue to exist as they currently do. And to wage those wars, you need the raw materials. As Galeano says in his section title here, as lungs need air, so the US economy needs Latin American minerals. And all of this is interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but because of the changing nature of war, it also means that the raw materials, literally the type of raw materials that you need, will also change quite a bit. And that will change and shift the dynamics of the world in very, very interesting ways. And you can see that in Galeano's work when he talks about the shift from nitrate to something that could be produced just from the nitrogen in the air around us. This is a really, really interesting shift that leaves Chile kind of grasping for copper. But now, copper is a required component for a lot of things that we produce. So it really all comes down to what does empire need at this particular point, and that dictates the fortunes of the developing world. But let's talk about the state now. Now, we keep coming back to this in this series that we're doing on open veins because there is a very important nexus, and I said this last time, between the state and private enterprise. Private enterprise needs the state, and the state needs private enterprise. And so what Galeano is describing here is a state that's willing to do basically anything to secure natural resources, both for itself, national security, and for private industry that it relies on for its very existence. And there are so many examples of this. At one point, Galeano is kind of going through them rapid fire, right? You have the overthrow of 2 Brazilian presidents for mineral rights. You have the Bolivian dictator Manuel Barrientos, who overthrew the government and immediately gave lead, silver, and zinc mine rights to the Dutch. Peru, at the same time, mysteriously lost part of a Standard Oil agreement that would have guaranteed prices to exported oil. In Venezuela, and this is pre-Chavez, by the way, that's what's really interesting about this section as you read it. But anyway, in Venezuela, the largest U.S. military mission sat on the Standard Oil and Gulf. Great Petroleum Lake is what he calls this. Meanwhile, Argentina is going through non-stop coups that were normally after oil concessions. The U.S.-backed dictator in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, is not just there because of the sugar, that's important, but also because of the significant deposits of nickel and manganese. And then the US also overthrew the government of Guyana for bauxite and manganese as well. There's a lot of stuff that he's just rattling off here, and this chapter is kind of littered with those stories. Now, in a later chapter, actually I believe it's the next chapter, we will get to this idea of sub-imperialism. So I'm actually fairly sure it is coming up in the next chapter, but this is a really, really interesting idea. Sub-imperialism is the idea of a local power operating on behalf of a foreign power to extend imperial control. So this happens throughout this chapter as well. And maybe one of the best examples of that is Chile invading Bolivia over the disputed nitrate fields. So nitrate was huge, of course, for Chilean, Bolivian, and Peruvian economies, but ultimately most of this was just kind of flowing right out of the country and back over to Britain, back to the metropole. But the wars over nitrate were to enrich those local economies nonetheless. It's sort of a imperialism through a separate imperialism, but it's all the way through just imperial means to extract this kind of natural resource. So you have a lot of this, and we've talked about a lot of this in previous chapters as well. You have direct military action, you have coups, you have CIA actions and covert actions, but it actually doesn't have to be just this either. There's plenty of levers that the state can pull just to exert power that have nothing to do with the military, or nothing directly to do with the military anyway. So Standard Oil, for example, may have employed a surveyor at one point to go and underestimate oil deposits in Brazil to undermine the local oil company Petrobras. Right, this is just after the inception of Petrobras. Hanna Mining, meanwhile, also in Brazil, played this really interesting long game that Galeano recounts really perfectly in this book, doing illegal mining, but also putting key people in a government that was deeply unfavorable to it and considering legislation that would have clamped down on Hanna Mining, but just slowly, over time, playing this long game. And when coup eventually came to Brazil, they were in a favorable position. Their guys were basically the last ones standing, and so they ended up with a favorable Brazilian administration. And all of the illegal mining that they had done just wasn't a problem anymore. And then there's that mysterious case in Peru that we just mentioned, which is another government comes in and discovers, that the last Peruvian government, the outgoing Peruvian government, had mysteriously lost the last page of an agreement that would have guaranteed a minimum price for oil exports, which is very interesting and very mysterious. So all of this is to say, when we talk about the nexus between the state and private enterprise, which we've talked about before, but there's a lot of different ways to exert influence. And all of that, of course, brings us to corruption. Now, this is something that I run up against kind of a lot. And if you talk to people about development or about underdevelopment or about developing economies, any of that, you will hear this story brought up over and over and over again. One of the stories that we always hear when people talk about development is that X country cannot develop because it is too corrupt, because of corruption. They're just naturally corrupt. They can't develop. Corruption is holding them back. There are corruption indices. There are ease of doing business surveys, all sorts of stuff to kind of measure and try to tamp down on corruption. But corruption like this, on this scale, doesn't exist in a vacuum. Corruption like this is enabled. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that corruption exists everywhere, all the time, all at once, right? There is nothing that's somehow naturally corrupt about these countries. Galeano spends a long time talking, for example, about people like Vicente Gomez, the former president of Venezuela. Now, Gomez was, of course, fantastically corrupt and allowed concessions to flow and money to flow to his friends and maintain control that way, all through Venezuela's oil wealth. But all of that only works in the first place if you have an international oil apparatus that will overlook that, or foreign partners who will see past it, foreign banks who will park the money that you're pulling out of the oil fields and lend to your country regardless. Corruption happens everywhere, all the time. What matters is the system and the international community that enables it in the first place. And this is one of the major things that I think you get from this chapter. And this is kind of an important takeaway because, this is not just something that I find myself arguing about all the time. I do, but it's also a perception that we all have in our heads of, oh, yeah, of course, there's corruption in Mexico that doesn't exist in the United States. That's for a reason. That's because that corruption is put there and enabled by an international system. There's a very famous example of a Mexican president, Miguel de la Madrid, who takes power after this book is written, in fact, but takes a bunch of loans from the international community and international banks and then extracts those loans loans in terms of personal wealth and passes them off to cronies and all of that. And all of that money finds its way right back onto the balance sheets of those same European banks that lent the money in the first place. And who's left with the bill? Not de la Madrid. It's, of course, the Mexican people. This happens all the time. And all of this takes us to the present moment, right? How do we understand the world now that we know all of this stuff about mineral wealth and metals and the way that this is exploited, the ways of the nexus between state power and corporate power, and the ways that corporations operate in places like Latin America? And of course, we're only talking about Latin America here, but this is a global problem. So let's talk a little bit about the present. And this, by the way, this is only one element of this, but I really want to focus down on this because it's a little tough to talk about, really. We want to finance a green energy transition globally. You know, Galeano talks a lot about national security. We could now almost talk about global security to exist and to maintain our current energy consumption, and that's kind of crucial. But to maintain those energy consumption levels, we have to transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy, to things like solar power and wind power. And all of that means a huge demand for minerals. Wind power, for example, requires a huge amount of copper, and the largest copper reserves in the world are in Chile, of course, and Peru. But for wind power, you also need zinc, and zinc comes from China and Mexico, and most of all, Australia. But of the developing countries, China and Mexico are very much in line. When you talk about something like solar power, solar energy cells require a tremendous amount of copper as well. And then if you're making electric vehicle batteries, you need tons and tons of course, copper, but also lithium. Lithium is Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. You need manganese, that's South Africa, China, and Brazil. You need cobalt, that's the DRC, that's Australia and Cuba. And you need graphite. You need a tremendous amount of graphite, and of course that's China, Brazil, and Mozambique. So the energy transition, which a lot of us, and if you're watching this video, you probably agree that it is very necessary, it will probably do exactly what we've been doing this entire time. What Galeano recounts in this book, just instead of national security, now we can talk about global security, but what we are ultimately doing is still extraction from the developing world. And we will just go in and we will take the minerals that we need. In fact, we're kind of already doing that now. And we'll just go. We think we need these natural resources, and we think the need for a green transition trumps the possible effects on colonized countries. But what really are the costs, and have we thought through them? And with that very depressing thought, as always, it seems sort of a tradition now that I end these videos on like a super depressing note. But on that super depressing note, we'll close chapter 3, and we'll come back next week to talk about chapter 4. That is, of course, Tales of Premature Death. And we'll talk all about protectionism. I love this topic. I just think this is one of the most fascinating topics. I wish the next chapter, chapter 4, was longer, but this is one of the shortest chapters in the book. Maybe the shortest chapter that's not the update that he gives at the end, which we'll spend a whole video talking about as well. But this next chapter, and protectionism, and the ways that the developed countries protect their own industries while arguing for free trade in every other country, fantastic, fascinating, and never more relevant to today. So I will see you there next week. Please do not forget to check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Like and subscribe, comment, all of that good stuff. I will see you next week, and thank you very much for watching.